really, when I come to speak here at Bethesda to all of you, the most important word that perhaps could be used to describe me is neighbor. Because I'm local. I live not in Maryland, but just over the line in Washington, D.C. So many of you may listen to me on the radio, but you also perhaps run into me at Foonlin, or running into Ben & Jerry's with young children, begging me for ice cream, or running into Stroh-Snyder's, which I seem to be at every single weekend. What is it? It's like it's this, those men in the red vests have this sort of magnetic quality, and we wind up there. I'm not kidding. We're at Stroh-Snyder's, it seems like every single weekend, and if we're not at Stroh-Snyder's, we're at that store next door that sells Bruce Variety. They sell everything. I think you could get a car battery there if you needed to. I mean, everything from yarn to, I think, you know, I purchased undershirts, and it's, so that's where you might see me on Saturdays. And if that happens in the future, please say hello. I'm so glad to be able to talk to all of you about this book, particularly in this period after it's been out for a while, and after I've learned from the people who've read it and the people who've come out to meet with me as I've gone out to talk about the book. I had the good fortune of going on a book tour in the wake of the publication of this book. I've been now to 40-some cities. And the wonderful and humbling experience for me is that I have learned from the people who've read the book. They read my stories, and often they come forward and tell me theirs. I'm looking at someone that I met very early in September, and you told me much about your story, and I hope that you've been documenting yours and capturing your own history. I am always amazed when I look at the book, and I have, this is sort of my personal copy, as you can see. It's been signed by lots of people, and I continue to collect things, but I'm always amazed when I look at it for a couple of reasons. I'm amazed that I actually produced a book, because I took a small amount of time off, but I wrote this book while considering all things every day before 4 o'clock. And it was, you know, it was quite a juggling act, and it meant that I was waking up, well, it felt like I was waking up before I went to bed. I was getting up so early in the morning, trying to do this while also mothering young children and working on that little show on NPR that I host every day at 4 o'clock. But I'm also amazed when I look at it, because there's 2 words in the title of the book that I never expected to see there. The book is called The Grace of Silence, and then in small words underneath it, it says a memoir. And that is still surprising to me when I look at it, because it is in every way an accidental memoir. I didn't set out to write a book about myself or my family. I wanted to write a book about race in America, but not necessarily my racial legacy. I thought that in the run-up to and in the wake of the last presidential election, that America was engaged in this really interesting conversation, that despite all the talk about sliding into a post-racial society, that from my perch in Studio 2A and my time spent on the road, on the campaign trail, I thought that America was actually not necessarily in a post-racial period, but in a period where people were thinking about race and identity in America in very animated ways. And they were talking about it in very interesting ways. And I felt that we always didn't get to that in the studio because we didn't have enough time to spend with people, or because in a studio setting, or when people knew that they were being recorded, it was a careful conversation. And at the ends of those conversations, I always felt that there was something that we kind of felt in the distance, but we didn't necessarily get to. I realized that, in particular, when Steve Inskeep and I spent some time on a project called the York Project. Stephanie referenced it. It was an examination of race in the 2008 vote. And what we did, both feeling that there was this other conversation that we wanted to get to, we decided that we would put a group of diverse voters together, and we would spend time with them. The idea was to do this in a comfortable setting, so that we could get to an interesting place in the conversation. We chose to do it in York, Pennsylvania, because Pennsylvania was an interesting state in the election. It was a city that had sort of an interesting racial history. There was a riot. Some called it a riot, others called it an uprising. It sort of depended on where you were when this happened. That followed police shooting. And it still sort of simmered in the community all these years later. So we thought, well, that would be an interesting place to go. And it was geographically desirable because Steve and I are like ships passing in the night. He hosts the sister show, which he reminds me has more listeners than we do. And I host the afternoon show where we take a little bit more time, as I remind him, to tell our stories. The two shows are almost like the morning and the evening meal. If you listen carefully, the tempo of the morning show is a little bit more like you know, a quick meal at breakfast, and we are a little bit more like a longer meal at dinner. And because of our schedules, we are often passing each other. So finding a time where we could do this together and sit down together is tough enough. And it would be very difficult if it required traveling to the other side of the country or a long distance. So York was close by. It was geographically desirable. We could get there and back, get there in about an hour and a half. And we had very particular thoughts about how this conversation should take place. Steve, who tends to get what he wants, wanted to do this in a room with a hearth. It was important that we do it in a space that seemed really comfortable because we wanted people to sort of let their hair down. We wanted them to get comfortable. And we thought, well, a conference room's not going to work. A restaurant's not going to work because there's too much going on. So we thought we'd try to find a space that looked like it might be something like Aunt Mabel's living room. And Steve said, well, it has to have a hearth. So we went all over the place trying to find a space like this that had a hearth. And we found one in an old hotel that had a suite at the top floor that was named for World War II general. It was rarely used. I think someone must have lived there at some time because the room had a hearth and it also had bookcases, and it was filled with all the kinds of things that Aunt Mabel would keep in her living room. Porcelain figurines and plates on displays and things like that. And when we saw it, we said, we're here. This looks like the kind of place where we could have a good conversation. So we got the hearth. My request was simple, that we had to do this around food. That if people were going to have an honest conversation, that we had to break bread together first. So I said, whatever we do, just make sure that we can feed people with the idea that carbohydrates and a killer dessert would really kick off the conversation. And that's what we did. And we went back to these voters 3 times, and we plan to go back again as we slide closer to the 2012 election. And the reason that we wanted someplace close that we could get to is we realized that we'd have to spend a certain amount of time with them, or that's what we thought, so that they could get to know each other and they could get to know us. We thought we'd really have to pry open the door to get them to talk, and we were so wrong about that. I mean, once we sat down and fed people, I think one of the first discussions came from a woman who is Caucasian. She's a white woman. She had adopted 2 children of another race, and one of her sons, who was in his 20s, had dreadlocks, and he was having a really hard time finding employment. And she wanted to put that on the floor to talk about why he was having such a hard time. Was it because of skin color, or was it because of his dreadlocks? And the most interesting conversation ricocheted around the room. The attorney, who's white, who's well known in town, said, well, you know, we talk about this in the office place because we might think that this person is wonderful and has all the right credentials, but they're also going to be going out into the world and representing the firm. And even though we know him, we trust him, we're very proud of him potentially as an employer, we have to think, what is that other person going to think of him? What are they going to think of him in a courtroom setting? He put it all out there. I don't know if it was the stroganoff that night, but you know, it was right there on the table, an interesting conversation. Then it ricocheted across the room, and an older woman of color said, well, you know, if my grandson was going out looking for jobs with dreadlocks, I'd tell him, cut him off. Because I assume that people will make assumptions about him based on the dreadlocks. And Steve and I thought that we were going to have to push and pry and cajole, and instead what we found is that people were so open and eager to have that conversation. At the end of that conversation, I don't know how many of you heard any of those segments. There were several of them, and they ran on Morning Edition and All Things Considered, and they live on the radio, they live online if you should want to ever go back and listen to them. And they were really, it was magical radio, and I'm not saying that because I'm trying to slap myself or pat myself on the back. They were magical because it was so honest. And it's something that you don't often hear, particularly around a conversation about race. At the end of that process, I still felt hungry for more. I wanted, you know, I figured if we sat down people in York, Pennsylvania and had this kind of conversation, what would happen if we went into boardrooms and college campuses? What would happen if we went to office parks and senior citizens' homes? And I had this idea about going out and trying to capture more of that conversation, to listen to it, and then to write a series of essays about how Americans are talking and thinking about race. My goal was to write about other people and to listen to this hidden conversation. What happened is when I sort of set my ear to listen to that hidden conversation, I started picking up really interesting things really close to home. When I would sit down with my family members, the elders in my family in particular, I realized that suddenly there was this either hidden conversation or sudden conversation. Either it had been there and I hadn't been paying attention to it, and I realized, well, that's not how I know what was going on. Instead, what was going on is, in the wake of this election, the elders in my family felt emboldened suddenly to start talking about things they had kept to themselves. It was almost as if there was this historic indigestion where all these stories that they had kept down suddenly started to come up. And you know what? It always happened over food. There we go again. It was always when we were sitting down and sharing a meal, one of these stories would come forth. And I know this happened in my family. I know because of the conversations that I've had that it's happened in many families involving people of color. And as more I travel and talk to people, the more I realize that this has happened in lots of families. That the historic nature of that election, and not just because a man of color was running, but also because there were two women vying for a spot in the White House. Suddenly people were just having different kinds of conversations. In my case, because my family of elders includes people who are people of color, who've been on this earth for long enough to remember a different America, for them it was as if something shifted and they felt emboldened to talk about painful things in their past that they hadn't talked about for a very long time. And this happened all across the family. There are members of my family who are deeply conservative, who, if they had an opportunity to sit down in a room with Barack Obama, they would have an awful lot to say to him. And it might not be entirely comfortable for him. And yet, despite their conservatism and their questions about some of his policies, they picked up a newspaper and saw in that newspaper a man of color, a black man, sitting at a really big desk in the Oval Office, a man who looked slightly like one of their grandkids. And something shifted in them. And for family members who were very excited about the prospect of an Obama presidency, something shifted in them too when they went into a voting booth and picked up a little number 2 pencil, not unlike the ones that some of you got when you walked in this room, and filled in a little circle on a ballot. A circle on a ballot that meant they were voting for a man of color. Because they were old enough to remember living in Jim Crow America, when to think of sending a man of color to the White House would be tantamount to trying to reach up and touch the sun. So in the wake of that, with all that shifting, that's what led to some of that indigestion that I referenced. And these stories started spilling out. And in my case, there were stories that were enlightening and there were stories that were very painful. And the more I learned about some of these stories, and I was going to say, if you read the book, but let me just say when you read the book, you will find out more about them. And you'll understand why, for me, they had a certain pull. It was like a current that pulled me in another direction. And I realized that the book that I had set out to write was not the book that I needed to write in that moment. The questions that came forth in these stories burned inside me, and I had to try to seek more about them. I had to learn more about these stories. I had to answer some of the questions that rose up because of these stories. And that's how I wound up writing an accidental memoir.